Today we're going to discuss camera settings for the GoPro and why they have such an important role in capturing smooth cinematic footage. When I first got my GoPro, I saw videos people shot with it, and compared to my DVR footage from my FPV drone, I was stoked to get the chance to step up my quality of footage with a better camera. But after recording some shots from my drone and then playing it back on my computer, I got incredibly frustrated with the quality of footage. The motion looked off. It didn't look realistic at all. It wasn't that smooth footage I was striving for that I saw from other creators and films. But then, after doing some research, I finally started piecing together why my footage looked like crap and how much of a game changer it was to learn about these settings on the GoPro. I truly believe these are the fundamentals to achieving quality looking footage, and you won't want to miss the last bit of info I'm going to share with you near the end of this video, which is, in my opinion, the only way to unlock the full potential of this camera sensor. So stick around to make sure you add this to your arsenal of tricks when it comes to getting the absolute best footage out of your GoPro. First, in this video, we're going to cover how to set your camera in manual mode and what these changes are doing to your footage. Then we'll take a look at footage shot in auto and manual mode side by side on the same camera so you can see for yourself just how much of a difference this makes in the quality of footage. And by knowing what these settings do, being able to adjust them for whatever shot you're going for in the future, whether it be for you or a client or anything in between. So the camera focus today is the GoPro Hero 8 Black, and from what I've seen, these settings will apply to any GoPro you have. So whether it be at 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, these settings will work the same. So let's take a look under the hood at the settings menu, and the settings we'll be messing with in this video today are: number 1, resolution and frame rate; number 2, shutter speed; number 3, ISO and ND filters and how they have an effect on lighting and exposure; number 4, miscellaneous options to set to your liking. From what I've researched, most cameras, when first purchased and used even on our phones, are set with auto settings, which does let you get straight to taking photos or recording video right out of the box without overexposing the shot or having to worry about adding light or adjusting these variables when having both light and dark scenes in the same shot. But the downside to this can be over or underexposed shots to your liking and really not knowing exactly what the shot you're getting is going to look like in post-production. And don't get me started on how bad and animated it makes motion look. When going for certain contrast or a vibe when shooting certain shots, this will never work. Let's start at the top with resolution. You can pick any resolution that suits your needs, from 720 up to 4K, depending on how fast your computer is at rendering and keeping up with what you're editing. And truthfully, on such small screens as a phone has, if most of your footage will be played back on one for social media or something like that, 1080 will work just fine. But for post-production and color grading, I'd go with the highest quality resolution your editing software can handle. Next, let's go to frames per second. The frames per second are exactly as it sounds. This will be how many frames the camera will take per second of shooting to create your video while recording. And they range from 24 to 240 frames per second on the GoPro. But right now, let's keep it simple and focus on 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. Whichever you choose will really depend on your preference to what the motion looks like or what you're trying to achieve with your footage. My go-to, and really the only one I use now, is 24 frames per second. This is the Hollywood standard. They use this for most motion captured films you see on the big screen. And after messing around with 30 and 60 frames per second as well, I started to see why this one has been the standard in film for decades. 24 has the most and best looking motion blur when locking the correct shutter ratio in, and we'll go over that next. Number 2, the shutter and 180 rule. So when choosing a shutter speed, it all depends on the frame rate that we've chosen. No matter the frames per second chosen, to get the right motion blur effect, the shutter must be set to twice the amount of frames per second. This is called the 180 rule. So for example, if you set 24 frames per second, your shutter speed, which is in a fraction, will be set to 1/48. When looking at this setting, disregard the 1 in the fraction and just focus on the second number. That is a number that needs to be twice the amount of the frame rate, or as close as you can get it depending on the camera option. So for 30 frames per second, you would set this to 1/60th. And for 60 frames per second, you would set this to 1/120th, and so on depending on your frame rate of choice. The shutter rule can be bent if you want to add more or less motion blur to what you're trying to record, but the 180 rule gives you the most natural look to your footage unless you're going for a certain type of shot. So now that we've locked in 24 frames per second and the 1/48th shutter speed, now if you take a look at your footage, and especially if you're outside on a sunny day, you'll see a very overexposed and blown out image, which is unusable. Since locking in the shutter speed, we lost control of the amount of light the camera's letting in, which varies when the shutter is in auto. And that's the trade-off. For better looking motion, we lose control of the amount of light that is coming in. But no need to worry, we got a few ways to combat this. And this is where the next section will kick off with ND filters and ISO settings. Since the image is very overexposed now, we need a way to bring that brightness down. And the first way we're going to do this is with ND filters. ND, standing for neutral density filters, basically is just a pair of sunglasses for your lens to cut back the amount of light getting onto the sensor. They can range from N8 to N32 and higher. But for me, I like to have an N8, N16, and N32. All these numbers basically mean is how dark they are, from 8 being the lightest and to 32 being the darkest. So once you set the frames and shutter speed, all you have to do once getting these filters are to put each one in front of the lens and manually look until it looks exposed correctly. It's that easy. Depending on sunset and sunrise to midday sun, these 3 filters will accommodate any of these situations. And if you're out at night recording or in a dark room, you can try these settings without an ND filter and it might expose it just right. But in case these ND filters make it a little too dark, but not bright enough to switch to another ND filter, there is one more trick with the GoPro you can use to adjust the lighting, and that's with the high ISO setting. This setting basically adjusts the brightness of your screen starting at 100 and going all the way up to 6400. But beware, that the higher you adjust this setting, the more noise you will introduce into the image, so use accordingly. Next up, miscellaneous settings. So these settings aren't a must, but they will help evenly shape your footage and make it better for post-production. Number 1, color setting. I set this to flat, which is basically log footage that you can color grade with later. If that's not an interest of you right now, leave it on GoPro color, where it will add its own contrast and saturation, but you will lose some detail in the shadows, and sometimes the saturation is way too much. But if you're just starting out, just focus on making sure you have your image properly exposed. Number 2, bitrate. I set this to high to help combat against compression. Number 3, white balance. Set to native, and I just adjust in post-production. Number 4, sharpness. Set to medium. Number 5, lens. I set this to linear because in post-production, it changes my footage to a 16:9 resolution as if you were setting it to wide or ultra wide. But if you're not using real steady, just leave it on wide. And I turn hyper smooth off for the same reason due to any post-production I do will render this through real steady. If you're not using this and want stabilization, you can turn this on. Now, let's compare some footage using the manual settings we just set up compared to auto settings you get right out of the box. As you can see in the footage, the manual settings we inputted are so much more fluent and look realistic compared to the choppy and oversaturated look from the auto settings. And I know this can be a bit of a process at first, from buying ND filters to getting cases for the GoPro to hold the ND filters, and for multiple types of mounting. You can't just turn on the camera and go out and shoot. You have to take these settings into account, and even though it takes a bit of planning and scoping out your environment for exposure, it's well worth the effort with the final product you get out of it. Since you stuck around this long watching this video, other than me greatly appreciating it, I will share with you the last tip to make your footage look even crisper with the GoPro, and that is by downloading GoPro Labs. This is an open source update for the GoPro that unlocks the sensor's full potential. You can get this update by going to the GoPro website, downloading the firmware onto an SD card, then search their websites for QR codes to download to help optimize the settings on your GoPro. I highly recommend this. I swear to you, it's almost like having a new camera with the options it brings. and it's completely safe to use and trusted by GoPro themselves. That's why they put it on their website. After I downloaded this firmware, I went to a fellow YouTuber's page called Nomad Aerial. I will link the video on which his QR code will fully unlock the sensor on your GoPro, and for any tips on color correction and grading, you need to check his channel out. He is an amazing pilot and a wizard at post-production with GyroFlow and DaVinci Resolve. So to recap, we have our camera set to 24 frames per second, 1/48th shutter speed, aka 180 roll, ISO as low as possible but always starting at 100, with all other miscellaneous settings to your liking. And that'll wrap up this tutorial. I hope you've learned something on this subject from this video, and please don't hesitate to ask any questions in the comments below about any of the subjects we've covered. If you've got time to like this video and subscribe, it would be greatly appreciated. And until the next one, good luck on recording your videos and get out there and practice.